The courtroom was colder than most people expected. Not physically, but emotionally, like a vacuum that sucked the warmth out of anyone who stepped through the heavy oak doors. It was the kind of room where stories died under cross-examination, and the truth often arrived too late. On the third floor of the county courthouse in a quiet New York town, the people gathered early. Attorneys shuffled thick files between tables. The judge, an older man known for fairness but few smiles, reviewed notes in silence. Rows of observers murmured. Reporters clicked pens. A wall clock ticked too loudly in the background. But in the far left bench, seated beside a kind-eyed foster mother named Janice, sat a little girl in a pale yellow dress. Her name was Lily. She was 3 years old and impossibly small for her age, with thin arms that clung tightly to a worn-out stuffed bunny named Pickles. Her curly blonde hair had been neatly combed that morning, though a few strands now curled into her eyes. She didn't move much. She didn't speak at all. Since the night she was rescued by police, Lily hadn't said a single word. 2 months. Earlier, neighbors had called 911 after hearing screams and strange banging noises through the thin apartment walls. When officers forced entry, they found signs of chaos: broken dishes, stained carpets, torn clothing, and behind a couch they found Lily, trembling and clutching Pickles. Her abuser was arrested on the spot, but proving guilt would be harder than expected. No eyewitness, no confession, no cooperation from Lily. She was the key, but her trauma had locked her voice deep inside. Now, after weeks in foster care, therapy, and gentle encouragement, Lily was sitting in the very courtroom where her case would be decided. No one expected her to testify. It wasn't even legally required. But her presence was considered a quiet show of strength, a symbol to the jury of the human cost at the center of the case. And seated on the other side of the courtroom, near the jury box, was someone who didn't belong in a courtroom at that all. A German shepherd named Max. Officer Daniels, his handler, wore his badge and uniform with a quiet pride. Max, however, wore a simple vest with the words K-9 support stitched in bold yellow across the side. He was no ordinary police dog. Max was trained not only in scent detection and tracking, but in emotional response, a therapy certified K-9 known for his intuitive bond with children and survivors of trauma. He'd worked with dozens of young witnesses during investigations. His mere presence often made the difference between silence and courage. Max laid calmly at Daniel's feet, eyes alert, ears twitching at every sudden sound, but always focused. He was the only one in the room not distracted by paperwork or legal jargon. His attention was on Lily from the moment she entered, and Lily had noticed him too. She hadn't said anything, but her gaze had followed the dog almost constantly. At first, she just peeked at him over the top of Pickles' ears. Then her body shifted slightly on the bench to face him more directly. She hadn't looked at the judge, the lawyers, or even the man accused of hurting her. But she was looking at Max. Janice noticed it first, the flicker in Lily's eyes. The way she blinked twice quickly, and then stared harder, like trying to remember something. Janice leaned down and whispered, "It's okay, sweetie. That's Max. He's a good dog." Lily didn't reply, but her lips moved, shaping the words silently. Max. The room quieted as the judge entered. The trial began with opening remarks. Prosecutors laid out evidence. Defense attorneys poked holes in timelines. A social worker testified about Lily's trauma. Words like alleged, incident, and insufficient echoed through the chamber, sterile and legal. But none of that mattered to Lily, because something strange was building inside her. A pressure, a recognition. It was the first time she had seen Max in person. But it wasn't the first time she had seen him at all. Her eyes grew wide. Her little chest rose and fell faster. And before anyone could stop her, She stood on the courtroom bench, pointed directly at the dog, and uttered the two words that would turn the entire case upside down. He knows. Silence isn't supposed to be this loud. But in that moment, when Lily stood on the bench and pointed across the courtroom, everything stopped. No papers rustled, no one coughed. Even the clicking pens paused mid-her. Her voice, so small it could, barely reached the far corners of the room, somehow echoed like thunder in the minds of everyone who heard it. He knows. She had said. The judge blinked, clearly caught off guard. The prosecutor's mouth remained open mid-sentence. Even the court reporter hesitated, unsure if what she just heard would be recorded as part of the official transcript. Officer Daniels shifted in his chair. Max, lying at his feet, raised his head. The 3-year-old's finger was still outstretched. Locked on the K-9 officer. Max stood slowly, not alarmed, not aggressive, calm, measured, as if he understood. He took one step forward, then another. Officer Daniels didn't stop him. He knew better. Max had done this before, but never in a courtroom. He only moved like this when something inside him responded to a presence, a signal of distress, buried trauma, or emotional urgency. What humans couldn't see, smell, or interpret, Max could. Lily's knees trembled as she stood, but she didn't sit down. Her lips pressed together tightly. The courtroom watched, transfixed. A few people gasped as Max walked past the gallery railing and slowly approached the bench where she stood. Objection. The defense attorney suddenly barked. The animal's movement is distracting and irrelevant. This is absurd. Overruled. The judge interrupted sharply, his eyes never leaving the dog. Max stopped at the edge of the bench. He didn't bark. He didn't sniff. He simply looked up at Lily, his dark eyes locking with hers. Then very gently, he placed his chin on her small knees and waited. Lily gasped softly. She dropped to her knees on the bench and hugged his head, burying her face in his fur. Her entire body shuddered, not with fear, but with something else. Release, recognition, safety. She's never done that, Janice whispered aloud without realizing. Her voice cracked. She's never touched anyone without freezing up. Number 1 moved. The courtroom had become a church of hushed awe. Lily pulled back just enough to look at Max again. You remember, she whispered. You were there. Gasps rippled through the room. Officer Daniels sat forward now, his brows furrowed. He remembered something. During the initial investigation, he and Max had briefly visited the apartment building as part of a sweep. Max had reacted strangely. Near the child's room, tail low, ears alert, pacing. But without physical evidence or visible distress from the child, nothing came of it. The moment had been noted and forgotten. But now, she recognizes him, Daniels muttered. Not just the idea of a dog. She remembers Max. Lily, the prosecutor said gently, stepping closer but staying low. Do you remember when you saw Max before? Was it the day the police came? Lily nodded slowly, then looked around the room, eyes full of something new, not confusion. Not fear, something like certainty. He came in. He looked at me and stayed. He didn't bark. He just stayed. Officer Daniels rose to speak, his voice calm. Your Honor, if I may. The judge nodded without hesitation. Max is trained in multiple disciplines, including emotional trauma detection. His response isn't a trick. It's behavioral, rooted in scent, posture, cortisol response, and prior exposure. He doesn't just comfort people. He identifies trauma. And he's doing it right now. A long pause followed. The judge tapped his pen thoughtfully. The prosecutor approached the bench. We'd like to request a brief recess to allow our trauma specialist to speak with the child, with Max present. What just happened changes everything. The judge nodded. Granted. Court is in recess for 15 minutes. Bailiff, clear. The gallery except for involved parties. Lily still clung to Max, as if he were her only lifeline. And maybe, in that moment, he was. 15 minutes passed like a strange dream. No one left the courtroom in the same mood they'd entered. The prosecution team huddled quietly, speaking in hushed tones with the court-appointed trauma specialist. The defense lawyer paced like a trapped animal, clearly rattled by the shift. The judge remained in his chambers, reviewing transcripts. And Lily was still sitting on the bench, gently stroking Max's ears. She hadn't said anything else, but she didn't need to. Her body had softened, her breath no longer sharp and shallow. Her shoulders had dropped from their usual tense, curled posture. It was subtle, but unmistakable. She was safe, for the first time in a very long time. Janice sat beside her, wide-eyed. This wasn't the Lily she'd cared for over the last 2 months. That Lily cried in her sleep and flinched at every door closing. That Lily wouldn't speak unless prompted, and sometimes not even then. This Lily, this tiny girl with tear-washed cheeks and trembling hands, was present. Connected. Awake. Max had done that. Double quotes. Hey, sweetheart, said Dr. Hartley, the child trauma specialist, kneeling down beside her. Do you mind if I sit with you a minute? Lily looked up. Then she nodded. Hartley slowly lowered herself to the ground, sitting on the floor to make herself as non-threatening as possible. You're very brave. You know that? Lily didn't respond, but her hand never stopped moving over Max's fur. Dr. Hartley continued gently. When you said, he knows, did you mean Max? Lily nodded again. He saw, she whispered. Hartley's eyes softened. Do you remember when Max came to your house? Lily hesitated. Her fingers gripped the dog's collar. He walked in. The other man yelled. He didn't yell at Max. He just stopped. Who stopped? Lily lowered her gaze. Her lips trembled. Him. Hartley let the silence stretch. Lily's voice, once a locked door, was now a crack of light peeking through. Did Max help you feel safe that night? Hartley asked softly. Lily's eyes welled up again. She nodded fiercely, clinging harder to Max's thick neck. He didn't leave me. He didn't go. From the back of the room, Officer Daniels took in a slow breath. He remembered that night now, clearly. Max had broken protocol, refusing to follow Daniels out of the apartment. He'd circled the girl's room over and over again until Daniels physically led him away. They thought it was just agitation. Now it was clear. Max had sensed her presence, even when she was hidden behind the couch. The judge returned from chambers, re-entering the courtroom with a composed but curious expression. Is the child comfortable remaining here for a few more questions? He asked gently. Dr. Hartley looked to Lily. The girl didn't speak, but her hand never left Max. Hartley nodded. She's okay, as long as Max stays. The prosecutor rose and approached carefully. Lily, can you tell? Use what happened that night. You don't have to say everything. Just anything you remember. Lily pressed her face against Max's neck again. Then, without lifting her eyes, she began to speak. Not in long sentences, not yet, but in small fragments. A shout, a door, her bunny falling, a loud bang, Max's paws on the floor. The way everything went quiet when Max looked at her. The courtroom held its breath. Her words weren't a confession or a rehearsed testimony. They were memories, unlocked slowly by safety and presence, by the feeling that someone, even someone who couldn't speak her language, had understood her pain all along. He didn't say anything, Lily whispered. He just stayed. He didn't leave me. Max responded with a small, soft whine, as if answering her. The prosecutor turned to the judge. Your Honor, I believe the court needs to consider the K-9 officer's response as indirect evidence of trauma recognition and consistency in behavior. I'd also like to enter Officer Daniels' earlier field report regarding that night. The judge nodded solemnly. Proceed. The defense attorney stood slowly, but even he knew the tone had shifted permanently. The jury wasn't watching him anymore. They were watching her. By the time the courtroom reconvened the next morning, word had spread. Not in the newspapers, not yet, but among courthouse staff, law enforcement, even within the DA's office. People spoke in whispers about the little girl in the yellow dress and the dog she said knew. Some thought it was just coincidence. Others, particularly those who had seen it firsthand, knew better. Lily was waiting quietly outside the courtroom, her tiny fingers tangled in Max's collar. He sat beside her like a silent guardian. Neither one moved much, but neither needed. Inside, the judge was reviewing new material, Officer Daniels' field report from the night of the incident. It was brief, just a few observations, but it mentioned Max's unusual resistance to leaving the apartment. There was also body cam footage. It didn't show Lily, who had been hidden, but it captured Max hesitating in a hallway, sniffing around the child's bedroom, circling twice, and then lying down at the door, a behavior he often used when alerting distress markers. The footage was subtle, almost unremarkable, unless you knew what you were looking at. The defense objected to the footage being introduced. It's speculation, Your Honor. Dogs don't testify. This court needs facts, not feelings. But the judge, unmoved, allowed the footage to be played. The courtroom watched in complete silence. As the grainy clip played on the screen, Lily was brought back into the courtroom. She clung to Max again, calmer this time, but visibly shaken by the audio. A loud voice, her abuser's voice, could be heard off camera. Max's reaction in the video was telling, ears down, tail rigid, body tense. He wasn't detecting drugs or explosives. He was reacting to fear, and it hadn't been his own. When the clip ended, Officer Daniels was called to the stand. Officer, the prosecutor began, can you explain to the jury what Max is trained to do when he senses trauma in a child? Daniels nodded, glancing down briefly at the girl by his feet. Max is dual-trained in scent detection and emotional response. Specifically, he's conditioned to recognize elevated cortisol levels in children. That's the stress hormone, as well as behavioral cues like flinching, breath patterns, and avoidance behaviors. When he senses trauma, he doesn't bark or bite. He responds by positioning himself next to the child and remaining there. That's what we saw yesterday. Has Max ever given a false response? Not in the 4 years I've worked with him. The prosecutor continued. And what did Max do when he first entered Lily's apartment? Daniels took a slow breath. He stopped, alerted in the hallway, refused to leave. And when I finally coaxed him back to the door, he laid down in front of the bedroom where she was later found. At the time, I didn't know she was there. A wave of quiet realization passed through the room. The jury was leaning in now. This wasn't just a dog sitting next to a child. This was testimony. In motion. Behavior as evidence. The judge turned to the defense. Would you like to cross-examine? The attorney stood reluctantly. Officer Daniels, are you suggesting this animal, though well-trained, can determine guilt or innocence? Daniels shook his head. No, sir, but he can recognize pain. And he recognized hers. Lily looked up at that moment. Everyone in the room turned as she softly repeated the words again. He knows. But this time, she didn't sound afraid. She sounded certain. And Max, almost on cue, gently nuzzled her hand and let out a long, soft sigh. There was something undeniably human about the moment, which made it all the more remarkable that it came from a dog. The tension in the courtroom had shifted. What had started as a typical child abuse trial had now taken on the feeling of something larger, something rare. A girl who hadn't spoken in weeks had said 2 words that cracked open a wall of silence. And now, all eyes turned to the one person who could explain how and why it happened. Officer Daniels was back on the stand, sitting upright in full uniform, hands folded carefully in his lap. Max lay at his feet, unmoved, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes, those dark, watchful eyes, never left Lily. The prosecutor resumed, this time with a softer voice. Officer Daniels, can you walk us through Max's training again? Specifically how he responds to child trauma. Daniels nodded. Max is one of a small group of K-9s, trained through a specialized program that combines scent work with behavioral response therapy. He was originally trained in narcotics detection, but around age 2, he was selected for emotional trauma work. That means he can detect certain pheromones and chemical changes, like elevated cortisol or adrenaline, especially in children. Explain how that connects to behavior. Dogs are naturally empathic. Max's training refines that instinct. When he senses a high-stress situation, not from noise, but from the body's response, he doesn't react aggressively. Instead, he positions himself close to the child. If the trauma's intense, he often won't move until the child feels safe. That's what he did yesterday. The jury scribbled notes. One juror, a middle-aged woman with a motherly presence, looked visibly moved. And has Max ever reacted falsely? In other words, has he ever shown these signs when no trauma was present? Daniels shook his head. Not once in 4 years. In fact, in training simulations, he's ignored dozens of neutral children and adults. He's laser-focused on stress cues. Max only responds when it's real. A defense attorney rose for cross-examination. His tone, though professional, was tinged with frustration. He hadn't expected to be arguing with a dog handler about trauma detection today. Officer, do you understand that this is a court of law, not a dog show? Objection. Sustained. The defense attorney rephrased. Are you qualified to medically diagnose trauma? Daniels didn't flinch. No, sir. That's what the psychologists are for. But Max doesn't diagnose. He responds. There's a difference. The attorney pressed. So everything you're saying, it's based on training and interpretation. Couldn't this be confirmation bias? You see what you want to see? Daniels leaned forward slightly. Sir, if I were seeing what I wanted, that little girl wouldn't be in this room at all. She'd be home. She'd be laughing. She'd be 3 years old again. A quiet murmur rippled through the audience. Even the judge paused, scribbled something in his notebook, and gave Daniels a slight nod. The prosecution stood again. Your Honor, in addition to Officer Daniels' testimony, we'd like to submit Max's K-9 service records and evaluation documents. His certifications, reaction logs, and results from psychological detection trials will show a consistent, unbiased response pattern, all within the bounds of admissible behavioral evidence. The judge glanced at the paperwork. So entered. Back at the defense table, the accused, a man in his early 30s with a smug, cold expression, finally showed a crack. His eyes darted toward Lily, then toward Max. There was something there now, not fear of justice, but recognition. As if he knew the dog remembered him. And Lily saw it. For the first time since entering that courtroom, she looked at the man who had hurt her. She didn't flinch. Instead, she slid her hand deeper into Max's fur and said, almost like a promise, he stayed. You didn't. The courtroom went still again. Daniels looked down at Max, who hadn't moved, not once, since the testimony began. And somewhere, in that silence, the weight of the truth settled over the room like fog lifting at dawn. After the powerful exchange in the courtroom, a recess was called. But no one moved. For a long moment, it felt as though the room was suspended in time, still absorbing the weight of Lily's words. Then, slowly, the spell broke. The bailiff ushered the jury out. The judge stepped down from the bench. Attorneys whispered and shuffled papers. Reporters exchanged glances, unsure of how to frame what they had just witnessed. There were facts. There were legal terms. But this was something else. Lily was escorted to a quiet room down the hall, one designed for child interviews. Soft lighting, pastel walls, stuffed animals on shelves. Max padded beside her, always just a few inches away. She held tightly, too. His harness the whole way, as if it were a lifeline. Dr. Hartley, the trauma specialist, entered after them, her voice a calming hush. She didn't start with questions. She never did. Instead, she sat cross-legged on the floor and waited. Lily sat near the window with Max, her knees pulled to her chest. She stared out at the courtyard below. A butterfly fluttered past the glass. She pointed at it and whispered, "It's not scared." Hartley tilted her head. "What makes you say that? It can fly. It doesn't have to hide." "Did you have to hide, Lily?" The little girl looked down at Max. She didn't speak. "Right away." Her fingers traced the stitching on his vest, over and over. Finally, she nodded. "He came in the room," she whispered. "He was mad. I dropped pickles. I didn't mean to, but I dropped him. Then he got louder." Hartley didn't interrupt. She didn't take notes. She just let the words come. "I tried to run, but he closed the door. I hid behind the couch. I covered my ears. I didn't cry. I didn't even breathe loud." Lily's voice was stronger now. Not loud, but firm, like she'd told herself the story 1,000 times in her mind, and now it was finally making its way out. And then the door opened, but it wasn't him. It was Max. She looked at the dog and smiled, just a little. He sniffed around and sat by me. He didn't bark. He didn't go away. Hartley's eyes glistened. "Do you remember what Max did when you touched him?" Lily nodded. "He licked my hand, just once. I didn't feel scared after that." Back in the courtroom, the judge reconvened proceedings. Dr. Hartley returned and took the stand. This time not as an observer, but as a key witness. She recounted Lily's statements word for word, describing how they matched known details from the investigation. The locked bedroom door, the shattered lamp, the missing stuffed animal later found behind the couch. Lily's descriptions were not vague guesses. They were exact, uncoached, unprompted, and most importantly, Hartley added, Lily was unable to share any of this in her previous interviews. She froze or dissociated. But in Max's presence, her neurological responses changed. Her breathing slowed. Her verbal processing returned. Max didn't just comfort her. He unlocked her voice. The prosecutor turned to the judge. "We move to submit Dr. Hartley's findings as admissible under Rule 702 for expert psychological testimony." "Sustained," the judge said, eyes steady. "Proceed." The jury was still. What began as a fragile child sitting silently on a bench was now becoming a story backed by science, observation, and behavior that couldn't be faked. The prosecutor approached the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're not asking you to decide this case based on emotion. We're asking you to see that the evidence, behavioral, testimonial, circumstantial, all points in the same direction. And a 3-year-old girl who couldn't find the words finally did, not because of coaching, not because of pressure, but because a dog sat beside her and stayed." The jury didn't need convincing. They already knew. And Lily, still, quietly seated beside Max in the adjoining room, said the words one more time under her breath. He knew. from the beginning. The courtroom felt different now. Not louder, still quiet, respectful, but filled with a new kind of gravity. No longer just a place of facts and files. It had become the stage for something deeply human. Truth had finally found a way to speak, and it came from the smallest voice in the room. Lily did not return to the courtroom that day. After her conversation with Dr. Hartley, the trauma specialist had recommended she remain in the family room with Max. The girl had said everything she needed to say, not with legal terminology or complex detail, but with clarity, innocence, and the kind of honesty that couldn't be rehearsed. The jury, now solemn, now attentive, had watched every moment. They'd seen the footage, heard the psychologist. They'd read the dog's service record and heard Officer Daniel's testimony. But none of that carried the weight of those two words from Lily, repeated softly, but with such conviction. He knows. The defense tried to recover, throwing out arguments that seemed flimsy now under the emotional truth laid bare in the trial. They argued about memory reliability, the ambiguity of the dog's behavior, the lack of direct physical evidence. They raised questions. They pointed to gaps, but none of it stuck, because even in the silence that had once surrounded Lily, the truth had been present all along, waiting for the right moment to come forward. And when it did, it was undeniable. By noon, the case was handed to the jury. They deliberated for 2 hours, not long, but not rushed. Inside the jury room, there were no raised voices, no arguments, just quiet reflection. They weren't deciding a legal theory. They were deciding justice for a little girl who had finally felt safe enough to speak. When the jury returned, every seat in the courtroom was filled. Extra officers stood by the walls. Even courthouse staff had quietly taken their breaks to sit in on the verdict. The accused sat stone-faced at the defense table, arms crossed. He hadn't looked at Lily once during the trial. Not when she entered, not when she spoke, not even when she pointed directly at Max. But he looked now. He watched the jury forewoman rise and unfold the verdict slip. The judge asked for the decision. The courtroom held its breath. On the charge of felony child endangerment, we find the defendant guilty. A collective gasp filled the room. On the charge of aggravated assault against a minor, guilty. A tear rolled down Janice's cheek. On all remaining charges, guilty. The judge nodded, slow and deliberate, before turning to the defendant. Sentencing will follow next week. The defendant is remanded to custody effective immediately. A bailiff approached and handcuffed the man where he sat. For the first time during the entire trial, his expression cracked, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with disbelief. He had underestimated her. All of them had. The courtroom erupted in quiet applause, a rare breach of decorum, but the judge allowed it. Even he wiped at his eyes. Janice stood outside the family room where Lily waited. She entered slowly, not wanting to startle her. Max was lying beside the girl, tail thumping softly against the floor. Janice knelt down and whispered, "It's over, baby. He can't hurt you anymore." Lily looked up. Max stayed. "Yes," Janice said with a smile. "He did." Then, in a moment no one had prepared for, Lily stood, walked over to the open doorway of the courtroom, and peeked. Inside, everyone turned as they saw her small frame step forward. Max right behind her. The judge noticed and gently gestured toward her. "Would you like to say something, Lily?" She looked around, at the jury, at the attorneys, at the rows of strangers. Then, she smiled, just a little, and said, "Thank you for listening." The room was still again, not with fear, but with something deeper, respect. The case had made headlines across the state, but not for the reasons people expected. It wasn't the graphic charges or the courtroom tension that caught the world's attention. It was the image of a small girl in a yellow dress, clutching a K-9 officer like a lifeline. The photo, taken by a courtroom sketch artist and later shared by the local press, went viral overnight. The caption read, "He knew." In the weeks that followed, Lily became a symbol of something larger than a single trial. A reminder of the power of presence, of listening, of quiet courage. But outside the headlines and hashtags, Lily was simply a child, one who had seen too much, lost too much, and now, finally, had a chance to begin again. After the sentencing, a maximum term without parole, Lily did not return to court. She never had to face the man who hurt her again. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, while she would move forward. Janice, her foster mother, had already begun the adoption process. It didn't take long. Every home visit, every assessment, every interview painted the same picture. Janice loved her, deeply, fiercely, like a mother who had been waiting her entire life for the right child to show up. At her door, broken. Maybe, but not beyond healing. Lily's days slowly transformed. Therapy sessions became lighter. Nightmares came less frequently. She started drawing again, mostly pictures of animals. And Max, always Max Dot, he was there for the beginning of her healing, and he would remain part of her life, even after the trial. Officer Daniels had arranged special visits to Janice's home. Max, now semi-retired, spent his weekends napping on Lily's rug and letting her dress him up in princess crowns and stuffed animal capes. He didn't seem to mind. On Lily's 5th birthday, her first birthday celebrated outside of a shelter, or emergency foster care, she had just one request. "I want Max to come." And he did. He wore a blue party hat, which lasted exactly 7 seconds, and patiently sat through 20 toddlers screaming, cake flying, and a balloon that exploded directly next to his head. Max didn't flinch. Not once. He just laid beside Lily as she opened gifts, accepting crumbs and pats like a guest of honor. Later that night, long after the candles were blown out and the cake smeared across the walls, Lily sat in her room drawing pictures. One showed Max with a badge on his chest and a speech bubble above his head that said, "I stayed." Janice peeked inside the room, smiling. "What you working on, sweetie?" Lily looked up and held the drawing out proudly. "I'm gonna hang it over my bed, so I don't forget." "Forget what?" "That he stayed. When it was scary, he stayed." Janice swallowed a lump in her throat. "He did, baby. And so did you." Lily tilted her head. "Did I?" "You didn't run. You didn't disappear. You stayed. You told the truth. That's brave." Lily thought for a moment, then nodded. Later that week, Lily had a visit with Dr. Hartley. It was more play than therapy now, full of puzzles and dolls and laughter. When Hartley asked, "Do you remember what it felt like in court?" Lily smiled, like I wasn't small anymore. Hartley blinked. "What do you mean?" Lily answered simply, "I had Max. He made me big enough." And with that, the story that began with silence ended with strength, a kind that doesn't shout, but changes everything anyway. A girl, a dog, 2 words. He knew, and because he knew, the world listened.